So Paul wrote the book of Ephesians while sitting in jail. Not an easy thing to do, especially if you want to encourage people. Most of us begin and we face a little bit of hard times, a little bit of difficulty. And finding time to praise or encourage others becomes a little troublesome. But Paul writes one of his most encouraging letters while stuck in a Roman jail, and saw someone that looked pretty much like me, though I must admit not quite as good looking, because I rock this. And as he's sitting in jail, and he looks at a Roman soldier, the one who is charged with guarding him, he concludes his letter by saying, "Put on, therefore, the full armor of God." He spends the first 3 chapters saying, this is what it means to have identity in Christ. Do you know how much God cares for you? And then chapters 4 and 5 are a call to mission. This is the way you live in the world. And chapter 6 is a little bit more mission, and then he concludes with this to say, put on the full armor of God. So, as we go through them today, we're going to put on the full armor of God. Well, this helmet is really hot. And it echoes in there. I couldn't tell if my mic was on. So he begins. You grab my Bible and open to Ephesians chapter 6. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to take your ground. And after you have done everything to stand firm then. He mentions first 2 important things that have to orient us to the way we put on the armor. First, our battle isn't against flesh and blood. Because of the work of Jesus, we no longer hold grudges or ill feelings towards someone else. We no longer participate when nations go to war. We don't look at someone else and say we get to stand in judgment or authority over you. Our battle is for people's lives and souls. So we don't get caught up in the physical realm when things tend to look bad. We keep our eyes focused on the work of Jesus and point people towards that. Jesus himself would say, don't fear someone who can take your life and then do no more harm. The physical ends for all of us at some point in time. Your physical being, your physical body, your life, even your memories will at some point in time in the future fade away, and it's true for everybody. History has forgotten more people than it's remembered. They just pass away. And Paul says, if we keep our eyes solely wrapped up into the physical, we too fade away and lose the power of our message that we have when we carry forward God's name. Instead, we fight against principalities and powers, against the spiritual realm, fighting for people's souls. And second, Paul highlights the devil's schemes, is the way it reads here in the TNIV. Literally, it's talking about trickiness, the practical joke that we fall to. Perhaps would have been fitting if this could have fallen around April Fool's and I could have put whoopee cushions on a few pews. Right? We get practical jokes, and we know those people in our lives that are, oh yeah, they had the buzzer in the hand again. Or yeah, he told me to smell this flower and it was one of the ones that she bought. Like, we get people that just sort of pull practical jokes. And Paul is saying that's precisely the sort of idea that Satan has about you. He wants to get you to trip up. He wants you to become frustrated. He wants you to quit. Because those practical jokes, they eventually begin to wear on our nerves. And if I'm going to go over to this person's house and every time I sit down there's going to be a whoopee cushion under my chair, then I'll just stop going to their house. And Paul says Satan's goal, his entire plan in the process of what Jesus is doing is to get you to just give up. What's the point anymore? If he does that, Paul says, he wins. So the only way to stand against those schemes is to put on the full armor of God. So, let me unarmor myself. Don't worry, I have clothes on underneath. Alright. And now we get to start all over. The first thing that Paul says, I need to take off my gospel shoes or keys. First thing he says you need to put on is the belt. The reason you would put this on first is because in war times, normally you're not wearing a compression shirt and Nike shorts. Roman soldier would have worn a tunic, a robe. A toga party is where his undergarments would have been. And if you've ever tried to run ladies in a dress, you know it can be a little bit cumbersome, right? And running in your undergarments, if they're long and baggy and go down to your feet, that gets to be pretty hard to do. So the first thing you do is you would put on a belt. That way when you need to run, you can tuck it in and free up your ankles and you can run better. And Paul says the first piece of gospel clothing that we put on is the belt of truth. Because it, like pants today need holding up, the belt is going to hold everything else in place. If you lose the truth of the gospel, everything else just becomes irrelevant. If you don't know why the resurrection of Jesus matters, if you don't know, especially reading Ephesians, what the power of Spirit-filled living looks like, what's the point in doing anything else? And if you don't walk out these doors and tangibly make a difference in the lives of those around you because of the difference that God has made in your own life, then what else is there to believe? If you walk around and all you do is profess words, oh, isn't God great? And it's not evident by the way you hold your life together with the truth of the gospel, nobody's going to believe you anyway. The gospel of truth holds everything else together. As we ready ourselves, the first thing we put on every morning is to say, am I equipped with the truth that the resurrection matters? When I go about my day, do people tangibly see a witness of God living in the world saying, there's more to life than this? If you don't do that, nothing else here is going to matter. The second thing Paul then tells us that we need to put on is our breastplate of righteousness. Righteousness is understood as our right status with God. Because the resurrection matters and we hold firmly to that truth, the conflict, the pain, the sort of endless, meaningless toil of life, all of a sudden with God finds a home and a resting place. We get to be relieved of the troubles in this world. If you notice, the breastplate is designed to cover the core of your body, somewhere where you are most vulnerable. And how many of us daily, constantly, sense the attack about our status with God, or our security, or our belief? Am I really a Christian? Does God really love me as much as He says He does? Does God really care for me the way the Bible tells me He does? Because, let's face it, that's a hard thing to believe. Because in human terms, it's easy to get caught up in it. Well, you were bad, so I'm going to withhold some sort of emotional attachment until you make it right. And God says, just come. That's a hard thing for us to accept. Yes, God, but I sinned, and if I do this thing first, then you're allowed to forgive me. Because I've got to make it up to you. And God says, it doesn't work like that way. That's not grace. Grace is, you know what, you messed up, but you're still welcome into the family anyway. So when we face attacks regarding our status, our security, our belief, the doubt in our heart that makes us wonder, does God really love me? The breastplate of righteousness protects our vital organs and equips us with the power to say, yes, he does. The next thing that we have to put on is our gospel shoes of peace. And in the Bible, we experience peace several different ways through the work that Jesus is doing. The two primary ones are with God and with each other. Paul highlights both of those strongly in the book of Ephesians. Because you have identified yourself as a person who has chosen to follow Jesus, you're a part of his family. That's Paul's message in Ephesians chapter 1. The first week had on the PowerPoint the list of terms that Paul uses. You're accepted. You have an inheritance. You belong. You're a member. You're kinsman. Paul uses 13 different words in one chapter to say you are a part of God's family. Peace, the gospel shoes of peace, are a reassurance of our status with God. No longer is there that dividing wall of sin between us, but we are a part of the family. The second way in which we experience peace is with others. That's what Paul highlights in chapters 2 and 3 of Ephesians. You guys should have all sorts of differences that the world says should keep you apart. But only in the church can Broncos and Raiders fans sit next to each other and worship the same God. I've upset a few people. It's okay. Because the world says those things should tear you apart, and God says not anymore. As long as you've got Jesus, you've got all that you need. So we have peace with each other when the world says, look at the way she's different. Look at how he's different from you. You should exclude him. And the gospel says, we're united because of the work of Jesus. There we go. Now we'll run. The gospel shoes of peace are also about movement. It's about extending that announcement of peace to others. Peace, biblically understood, is about the restoring of the way things should be. We see it in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. We see it at the end of the book of Revelation. And everything in between is just how messed up everything is. And God's whole plan of redemption, his whole plan of salvation is to say, I want to get things back to the way they should be. Back to perfection. So when we put on the gospel shoes of peace, we are declaring ourselves members of God's mission. We will go out the same way that God has and extend that good news to others. Because we can look at our community and say, it's quite clearly one that struggles and has conflict. I used to, when I was in seminary, do security for the school, and it would entail going around at 10 o'clock at night when the doors closed and making sure everything was locked up. And there were most nights, in fact, that I could walk out the door and I would tell Elise, I'd shout back through our open window and say, don't worry, the police helicopter's flying overhead, so I got back out. Like, we just lived in an area of Fresno where it was almost nightly. The police helicopter was out looking for somebody. I saw drug busts go down on campus as people tried to cut through. We lived in an area then, and we still do now, where we can just look out and say, there are a lot of people that are hurting in this world, that have never experienced peace of any kind, let alone a lasting, unfading, unwavering, unchanging one that only God brings. And when I equip the shoes of the gospel of peace, I say, I agree to go out and spread that message. Do you know that there's a better way in this world? Do you know there's something outside of whatever garbage your life is wrapped up in that God can fix and help? So we don't equip the shoes of peace just for our own good. Yes, they provide us protection in that way. Shoes serve that purpose. They provide us our own protection, but they're also about adding movement so we can go. So we can go longer distances, go to the ends of the earth, as Jesus tells us to, and spread the hope that he brings. The next thing that he says we need to equip is our shield of faith. That we put on the shield so that we can protect ourselves against the flaming arrows of the evil one. Again, more attacks, Paul says, are going to be coming your way. You want to live the sort of life that God says is required in this world, just beware Satan is going to try and stop you. We're all going to face periods of doubt or fear or temptation. We're all going to have bouts of worry where we lay awake at night wondering, boy, is God really doing something? We have those nagging little persistent thoughts that fill our head, that keep us awake at night. Where we say, is this really all there is to this life? But if I go talk to that person, something bad could happen. You're right, Paul says. Something bad could happen if you decide to equip yourself with the shoes of peace and say, I need to go tell others just how much God loves them. Paul says you should be expecting an attack. So put on the shield of faith. One that says, I will be able to stand and defend myself against Satan's attack. Well, who are you to go out and share good news with them? Look at how messed up your own life is. And the shield of faith says, you're right. I'm not perfect, but I do have God, and he's forgiven me. Martin Luther, on his conversion, shared that he had a vision one night. One of the kings of the Reformation broke away from the Catholic Church, started the Protestant faith, said he had a vision one night where the accuser stood before him in his bedroom with a list of a sheet of every sin that he had ever committed. And he said, Satan started to read that list up. From the time he was very young to his present age, here's a list of everything you've done wrong. And when he got to the end, Luther looked at him and said, you're right. You are absolutely right. But I've got Jesus. And proof, he said, he disappeared and knew the assurance of his salvation. The shield of faith equips us in those moments of doubt or fear. The next thing we equip is our helmet of salvation. I'm going to tuck my ears back so it doesn't echo. Salvation is about a restoration. I don't like the echo. Pretend I have the helmet on. Salvation is about our restoration and our status with God. Literally, it means to make wide open. That when we are trapped in sin, we choose to walk a bounded, constricted path where we don't see any way out. Sort of like farmers, my dad raised sheep growing up. In the winter, you have to have them in a small little pen so they don't just wander off and get lost. And then when springtime comes and the grass begins to grow and you don't have to worry about their safety quite as much, you can open the pens and let them just grow wherever they want. That's a good picture for what salvation does. When we are trapped in our own sin, we think very narrowly. Because sinning, let's be honest, is when you choose your own preferences over someone else's. Anytime you sin, the root of it is always you want to get your way. Doesn't matter what the sin is. I don't care what it is. Sin is you choosing your own way in your own power, in your own time. And salvation, God's plan is to say, you get to experience the wide open graces that I've given you. You now don't have to worry about your own life because I've got your back, God says. You don't have to be bound and consumed with making sure you get your own way because I've already saved you. You've already been redeemed. You've been purchased. You owed something to Satan that you couldn't pay back. Don't worry, I paid the debt for you. You know, there are times you go out to eat and you get the bill and you're like, oh, man, I wish I had some wealthy benefactor to pay this bill. God steps in and says, all right, I paid for it. The helmet of salvation is our reassurance, it's our mark that we belong to God. Think of it almost like a family crest. That with it I am marked as an inheritor of God's coming, fully inaugural kingdom. I've been sealed with the symbol of God to say that I belong. The last thing that Paul says we put on, that we equip ourselves with daily, is the sword of the Spirit. And interestingly enough, if we pay attention, we also realize this is our only weapon of attack. The rest of them are meant to defend. I've got my belt so I can gather up my extra clothing and make sure I'm ready. I've got my breastplate, I've got my shield, I've got my helmet. Now, Paul says, finally, once you are fully convinced of the assurance of your own status and acceptance with God, arm yourself with the sword of the Spirit. And a lot of times, we sort of look at it and say, well, that's the Bible. We need to grab the Bible, we need to read it, we need to memorize it, we need to use it. That's good. But remember, Paul's writing at a time where they don't really have the Bible yet. Ephesians is one of the first books written actually in the New Testament. So he is saying the sword of the Spirit is the power of God among his people. It's us. You are to equip yourself with fellow believers who can hold you up, who can encourage you, who can say, you're fighting a tough battle, don't worry, I will stand right by your side and make sure you get through this. Paul mentions it again earlier in chapter 5. This is the second time he's mentioned it in 5:26. Let me just read it. 5:26, he says, he's talking about this. We'll start in verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word. He's talking about baptism in the church. The way you lead godly in chapter 5 is you call people to participate in the life and the body of the church. It's where they find hope and salvation, assurance, and their right standing with God. All of the things that Paul has already said we need to equip ourselves with. The sword is our calling to go and provide that to others. The tangible witness of the church is our one offensive weapon that we carry out. Interesting surveys have been done in other communities where they will just go up to random people on the street and say, oh, you live in this neighborhood, what do you think of that church down around the corner? What do you think of that church there that meets on Thursday nights? What sort of stuff do they do? If you're ever daring enough to ask that question, you've got to be prepared for results that may not be quite as flattering of the church as you'd like to hear. The one weapon we have that we go out with and call others to salvation is the tangible witness of the way we treat each other. But that's sort of what Paul has been saying all along, isn't it? Chapters 4 and 5 and the first part of chapter 6. You want to know what the church looks like? Here's the way you should be being. Do you know that the world says you should have all of these differences and there should be no way you guys get along? And the church is one place where we say, those differences don't matter as long as we've got Jesus. The Word, the sword of the Spirit, is the power of God at work among His people. And that's only an effective weapon if you are being transformed by the work that Jesus is doing. So if we look, and we were to ask a question among ourselves, well, how good do we think we're doing? Before we get to the sword, because it's the last thing we equip ourselves with, if we want to go be an effective witness, if we want to go out there and actually make a difference, then in here we've got to first take stock and say, how are we doing the rest of it? Do we equip ourselves? And I should just go down the road. Do you equip yourself? Do you equip yourself? And do we as a church equip ourselves with the belt of truth? Do we gather every Sunday convinced that the resurrection of Jesus actually means something? Because if it's just something you go to do, Paul says don't bother. You're not going to go out and win people if you don't think the resurrection makes a difference. Have you, individually and as a church, decided to put on the gospel shoes of peace? Are you committing yourself to go out and live on God's mission, calling people to hope and salvation? If you're not willing to do that, then don't bother doing anything else. It's not going to matter. Do you have the breastplate of righteousness? Can you sit here and say, I don't know why God chose to love me, but He did. I'm a sinner. I do more than I'd like to admit, but you know what? God still accepts me. I've been made right with Him and with the people sitting to my right and my left. Do you put on daily the shield of faith, saying, I know attacks will come, not only on me, but on my brothers and sisters, and I have to be there for them? Are others' status and salvation and position with God more important than your own personal preferences? If they're not, then we're not going to get very far as a church. Because the church is the one place where we say, because of God's work in my life, I don't have to worry about myself. Jesus says it. Don't worry. You see the lilies in the field? Yeah, they're beautiful, but God cares about you more than that. Do you see the sparrows? You buy 2 of them for a penny. God doesn't forget about them. There's no way God's going to forget about you. Do you put on the helmet of salvation? Are you assured that, you know what, I've got a long list of sins that I've committed, but by the grace of God, they've all been forgiven? And only when the church can stand up fully equipped to do that, do we have any sort of hope of going out with the power of the Spirit and making a difference in other people's lives. We said, as part of our 5-year goal when we started this year, we think the sign of a healthy church is regular baptisms. And we didn't define regular baptisms. That could be once a year, that could be twice a year. We're not so much concerned in the number, but we are concerned about people saying yes to Jesus. We think that actually matters. And so far, for the last 2 years, we've done baptisms. Praise God. Because we have decided to say, we want to look towards the interest of others and say, you matter. Yes, I've got my own preferences, I've got my own desires, but I'm willing to give those up if it means someone else might come to know Jesus. And that's it. That tangible witness, the way we live in front of a community that's wanting to know, is there really good news found in Jesus? The only offensive weapon we have, the way we take ground, is the way we care and show concern for others. And the armor is great. It's useful. It has more than just cosmetic appearances, as great as you may look. It's great, but only if you commit to using it. And far too many of us, I'm convinced, not just here but in the church in general, wonder, why do we fall victim to attack so much? And I'm convinced it's because we don't care to put on the armor. We've sort of said the one time, look, I said the prayer, what else is there? I know someone who's taken that stance. I said the prayer, I'm going to heaven, what do I need the church for? And then they wonder why their life is so hard. Because you've got no one there that can come and help you. The Christian life is not some sort of Lone Ranger mentality where you just get to go off gun blazing, do whatever you want. It's the work of the Spirit of God in His people, living, as Jesus said, light and salt in the world. And then, interestingly enough, if you pay close enough attention, there's no back protection. Outside of this cape, I've got nothing back here that's protecting me. Because the Christian doesn't retreat. And far too many of us, when we face even the slightest bit of temptation, just decide to tuck our tails in and run. And then wonder why we never make very much spiritual progress. Because if the resurrection matters, what do you have to be afraid of? If you are committed to living on God's mission and sharing that with others, God's Spirit encourages and pushes you forward, outward into the world. If you have put on, I don't need to run away. But far too many of us decide, oh, this is getting just a little bit too hard. Let me just turn around and retreat a little bit. That's why we fall victim. Paul says, you're not meant to run away. Because you, church, are the only tangible witness of God in the world. And when you forsake that calling, when you give up on that, and you decide to run instead of advancing, you're going to fall victim. It's why the New Testament writers, Paul and others, had to write so frequently, look, don't fall victim to false teachers or people who are in it for their own glory. Because they're going to lead you astray and leave you prone to attack. Jesus, when He commissioned Peter in the book of Matthew, says, you are Peter, you are the rock, and on you I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not be able to stand against it. Gates are defensive weapons. They're meant to keep people out. And the church's mission, when we are living together in unity, says we're going to bust down those gates and we're taking as many people as we can with us. Picture a basketball game. If you already knew, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that you were going to win, the question isn't, hey, are we going to win today? Do we have to try hard to win? No. The scenario is you are going to win. All right? You're playing basketball, you're playing football, you're playing soccer. You are going to win. Then the only question for the Christian is, well, how much are we going to run up the score? If Jesus has already said, look, through the resurrection, humanity gets to win, if the church's response is, well, how badly do we want to hurt Satan then? If the resurrection matters, then let's run up the score. Let's take as many people with us to live in God's kingdom as possible. Jesus says the gates will not be able to stand against the good news of the church living as it should. When the church does its job right, there's no way Satan can even get a word in, and people are just going to be flocking into the church. We don't run. We've already won. The question is we want to decide everybody else matters more than I do. Let's bring you into the kingdom. Let's pray.